Ever wondered what happened to sex workers who broke rules in medieval times? Did you know some prostitutes had to wear special clothing to mark them as different from respectable women? Number 9. The last resort. Banishment and death penalties. Imagine breaking a rule and never being able to return to your home again. For medieval prostitutes, this was a frightening reality. When a sex worker repeatedly violated city ordinances, authorities often resorted to permanent banishment. This meant being physically escorted to city gates and formally forbidden from ever returning, sometimes with their faces marked or branded to ensure they would be recognized if they tried to sneak back in. In some extreme cases, particularly in times when religious fervor swept through communities during plagues or political upheaval, penalties escalated to death. These executions weren't private affairs either. They served as public spectacles designed to warn others. In Vienna, records show that prostitutes caught operating outside designated areas for a third time could face drowning in the Danube. Meanwhile, in parts of France and Germany, some unfortunate women were buried alive or burned alongside their brothel if they were found harboring clients with contagious diseases. The renowned Great Law of Venice, established in 1358, stated that any prostitute who knowingly spread disease could be banished permanently, with a possible death sentence if they infected a nobleman. These harsh punishments reveal how deeply medieval society feared moral and physical contamination, often blaming prostitutes as scapegoats during times of crisis. What's particularly surprising is how quickly a city could flip from tolerating prostitution as a necessary evil to violently persecuting it. When Emperor Sigismund visited Augsburg in 1418, the city initially welcomed prostitutes to entertain his entourage, but then executed 3 sex workers weeks later for allegedly practicing witchcraft. This quick shift from acceptance to execution demonstrates the precarious position these women occupied in medieval society. Number 8. Taxation and economic controls. Did medieval cities really profit from prostitution? Absolutely. The sex tax was a considerable source of income for many medieval municipalities. In 15th century Dijon records show that the prostitution tax accounted for nearly 6% of city revenue, more than the tax collected from all bakeries combined. City officials weren't shy about collecting this money either. In Florence, tax collectors would visit brothels weekly, sometimes accompanied by armed guards to ensure proper payment. The most famous taxation system existed in Southwark, London, where brothels, known as stews, operated under license from the Bishop of Winchester. This arrangement was so well known that prostitutes became nicknamed Winchester geese. Each establishment paid substantial quarterly fees, plus additional taxes based on the number of women working there. The church's involvement might seem shocking today, but medieval pragmatism often trumped moral concerns when revenue was at stake. In some German cities, prostitutes had to pay a special immorality tax, Unzuchtsteuer, that ironically funded orphanages and homes for unwed mothers. This created a circular economy, where those marginalized by sex work indirectly supported others who might otherwise end up in the same profession. In Valencia, Spain, municipal records from 1311 show that taxes from the public brothel helped finance the construction of city walls, literally building protection for citizens with money from a profession many considered morally corrupt. Some cities got creative with their taxation. In medieval Bruges, prostitutes could reduce their tax burden by donating candles to local churches, creating a bizarre situation where religious institutions physically measured and weighed these sign offerings to ensure proper value. Meanwhile, in parts of Italy, medical examinations intended to check for disease doubled as taxation opportunities, with each inspection requiring a fee that went straight to city coffers. The economic control extended beyond simple taxation. In many cities, prostitutes were forbidden from writing wills or owning property outside designated areas, ensuring their earnings eventually returned to municipal control. This systemic economic exploitation meant that despite sometimes earning good money, few prostitutes ever escaped their profession through financial independence. Number 7. Restricted movement and curfews. Could medieval prostitutes just wander anywhere they wanted? Not even close. Most medieval cities implemented strict movement regulations that controlled when and where prostitutes could appear in public. These constraints were often exceedingly specific. In 14th century, London prostitutes were forbidden from walking on the north side of Cheapside, while in Paris, they couldn't cross the Seine River after Vespers. Evening prayers. Curfew regulations varied widely between cities, but shared a common purpose: keeping prostitutes away from respectable citizens during certain hours. In Avignon, when the papal court was in residence, prostitutes had to return to their designated quarter by the first bell after sunset, or face fines that doubled with each hour they remained out. Similar rules in Barcelona required them to be in the city's official brothel, El Raval, before church bells rang for evening prayer. Some cities created elaborate systems of physical barriers to enforce these movement restrictions. In Vienna, gates blocked the entrance to prostitutes' quarters after dark, not to keep them safe, but to keep them contained. Guards posted at these entrances collected fees from late returning women or clients seeking after-hours services. In Bologna, records from 1454 describe a system of chains that physically blocked prostitutes from entering certain streets, especially those leading to churches or noble residences. Religious festivals complicated these movement restrictions even further. During Holy Week, across much of Europe, prostitutes were completely forbidden from appearing in public, with some cities like Seville requiring them to retreat to designated houses of penance. Conversely, during certain carnival seasons or fairs, movement restrictions temporarily relaxed, acknowledging the economic reality that visitors expected such services. The most extreme movement restrictions appeared in German-speaking regions, where some cities required prostitutes to remain physically chained to their brothels, except during specific hours. In Ulm, municipal records describe iron ankle bracelets that marked certain repeat offenders who had previously violated movement ordinances. Meanwhile, in Regensburg, prostitutes needed written permission slips from city officials to visit markets or attend church services. Documents that came with their own fees, of course. Number 6. Munert medical examinations. Think modern STI testing is invasive? Medieval prostitutes faced rudimentary and often humiliating public health controls. In the wake of devastating syphilis outbreaks that swept through Europe, starting in the 1490s, cities scrambled to implement medical inspection systems for sex workers. In Valencia, Spain, a municipal doctor known as the Padre de la Mancipia, father of the brothel, conducted weekly examinations of all registered prostitutes, charging fees for each inspection. These examinations were far from private or dignified. In many French cities, inspections took place in semi-public settings with multiple women examined simultaneously. Those found to have visible symptoms were often immediately branded or had their noses partially slit to mark them as disease carriers. In Toulouse, infected women were quarantined in a separate section of the municipal hospital, where records suggest they received minimal care and were sometimes subjected to experimental cures involving mercury, a treatment that frequently caused more harm than the disease itself. Before the syphilis pandemic, medical controls focused primarily on leprosy. Prostitutes in medieval London were regularly inspected for signs of leprosy at Southwark's Leper Hospital, with those showing symptoms immediately expelled from the city. Similarly, in northern Italian cities, prostitutes underwent mandatory bathing rituals, supposedly designed to reveal disease, but also serving as opportunities for additional taxation. Some cities combined medical inspection with religious oversight. In 15th century, Dijon prostitutes underwent examinations overseen jointly by a physician and a priest, with the latter claiming to detect spiritual corruption that might manifest as physical disease. Those who passed these dual inspections received certificates they had to produce when questioned by authorities. In Vienna, medical inspections intensified during plague outbreaks, with prostitutes often scapegoated as disease vectors, despite little evidence supporting this connection. Perhaps most disturbing were the treatments prescribed to those found infected. In many cities, prostitutes diagnosed with diseases were forced to undergo painful procedures like cauterization with hot irons or application of caustic substances. Records from Montpellier describe a treatment regimen where infected women were required to drink vinegar mixed with iron filings for 7 consecutive days, a concoction that likely caused serious internal damage. In contrast to this punitive approach, a few progressive cities like Florence established dedicated recovery houses where infected prostitutes could receive actual medical care, though these were rare exceptions. Number 5. Required religious observances. Could a medieval prostitute skip church? Absolutely not. Despite their marginal status, prostitutes faced strict requirements to participate in religious life. These obligations weren't about spiritual welfare, but public penance and community control. In many cities, prostitutes were required to attend specific church services, often sitting in designated areas where they would be visible to the community but separated from virtuous women. In medieval Seville, prostitutes had to attend Mass every Sunday and feast day at the Church of All Saints, where they sat in a cordoned section near the entrance. They were forbidden from wearing their usual finery during these services, and instead had to dress plainly, creating a visible display of temporary penitence. Similarly, in parts of France, prostitutes paid special fees to the church that guaranteed them burial in consecrated ground despite their sinful profession, an arrangement that filled church coffers while providing spiritual insurance to women worried about their afterlives. Some cities implemented elaborate religious rituals specifically for prostitutes. During Holy Week in Naples, registered prostitutes participated in special processions where they publicly asked forgiveness for their sins. These ceremonies served dual purposes, reinforcing the women's marginal status, while also publicly demonstrating the Church's willingness to offer potential redemption. In Vienna, prostitutes were required to attend special sermons delivered by designated preachers who specialized in exhorting them to leave their profession, though few economic alternatives were actually provided. The most famous religious requirements appeared in papal territories, particularly Avignon, during the 14th century, when it served as the seat of the papacy. There, prostitutes underwent mandatory confession every 2 weeks and had to demonstrate knowledge of basic prayers and religious concepts during regular examinations by parish priests. Failure to comply could result in fines or temporary prohibition from working. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, prostitutes paid special taxes directly to certain churches, creating the paradoxical situation where religious institutions financially benefited from the very sin they condemned. Holidays brought additional religious obligations. On St. Mary Magdalene's feast day, July 22nd, prostitutes in many European cities were required to attend special services, honoring their patron saint, the biblical figure believed to have been reformed from prostitution. In Barcelona, prostitutes participated in a procession where they symbolically donated their earnings to charity, though records suggest these donations were often redirected to municipal funds rather than actually helping the poor. Number 4. Clothing and identification requirement. Ever spotted someone instantly by their outfit? Medieval authorities made sure prostitutes couldn't blend in with respectable society. Across Europe, sumptuary laws, regulations controlling who could wear what, forced prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing or markers. These rules served dual purposes, preventing prostitutes from deceiving respectable men and ensuring they remained visibly separate from honorable women. The specific markers varied widely by region. In 13th century Marseille, prostitutes had to wear a striped hood, while in parts of Italy they were required to wear yellow veils or scarves. London prostitutes wore striped hoods with distinctive red and white patterns. Perhaps most humiliating were the requirements in some German cities, where prostitutes had to wear bells sewn to their sleeves that jingled as they walked, announcing their presence to everyone within earshot. These clothing requirements weren't simply about identification. They deliberately prevented prostitutes from following contemporary fashion. In medieval Paris, a 1360 ordinance prohibited prostitutes from wearing fur, trim, silver belts, or embroidered hoods, regardless of their wealth or status. Similarly, in Florence they were forbidden from wearing pearls or gold jewelry, even if they could afford such luxuries. These restrictions served to visually reinforce social hierarchy, regardless of economic reality. Some cities implemented complex clothing codes that changed depending on location. In Venice, prostitutes could wear fine clothing in their designated work areas, but had to change into marked garments when entering other parts of the city. In Bologna, they could remove their identifying yellow veils only when inside brothels or their private homes. This created logistical challenges as women needed multiple outfits and had to find places to change when moving through different city zones. Enforcement of these clothing laws was surprisingly rigorous. Records from Dijon describe special officers who could stop women on the street and inspect their clothing for compliance. In some Spanish cities, penalties for prostitutes caught dressing above their station included public stripping, where the offending luxurious garments would be forcibly removed in the marketplace, a punishment designed to humiliate rather than simply enforce regulation. What's fascinating is how prostitutes continuously found creative ways to subvert these rules. In Venice, women would wear the required yellow scarves, but make them so small they were barely visible. In Paris, some wore the mandated striped hood, but crafted it from expensive materials, technically following the law while still displaying status. This cat-and-mouse game between regulators and the regulated led to increasingly specific ordinances, with some city codes dedicating pages to closing clothing loopholes. Number 3. Designated red light districts. Where could medieval prostitutes legally work? Only in carefully controlled areas. Nearly every major medieval city established specific districts where prostitution was permitted and strictly forbidden everywhere else. These areas, often called red light districts today, though that specific term came much later, were typically located near city walls, ports, or other marginal areas separate from respectable neighborhoods. In London, prostitution concentrated in Southwark, conveniently outside city jurisdiction, but close enough to serve urban clients. Paris had its notorious Rue Chapon and Rue Tire-Boudin, literally sausage puller street, a crude reference to sexual services. Barcelona's red light district, El Raval, remains famous to this day. What's striking about these districts is how their locations were carefully planned to be simultaneously accessible, yet separate from everyday life. Many cities physically walled off these districts. In 14th century, Toulouse, the official prostitution quarter, Castel, had its own walls and gates that closed at night, essentially creating a controlled ghetto. Similarly, Vienna's women's house, Frauenhaus, operated behind high walls with a single guarded entrance. These physical barriers served multiple purposes, containing moral contamination, facilitating taxation, and protecting the businesses from religious zealots who occasionally attacked such establishments. The most elaborate system existed in medieval Valencia, Spain, where the public brothel, Mansbia, operated as a small, self-contained city within a city. This complex contained not just rooms for prostitutes, but dedicated taverns, bathhouses, medical offices for examination, and even a small chapel. Women rarely left this compound, creating a lifetime of confinement that blurred the line between regulated tolerance and imprisonment. City authorities strictly enforced these boundaries. In Paris, prostitutes caught operating outside designated areas faced escalating penalties. First offense brought fines, second resulted in public whipping, and third led to banishment from the city. Records from 15th century Nuremberg describe specialized night watchmen whose primary duty was ensuring prostitutes remained within authorized areas after dark. What's particularly interesting is how these districts functioned economically. Many cities auctioned monopoly rights to operate brothels in these areas, creating systems where brothel masters, sometimes women themselves, paid substantial licensing fees to authorities. In return, these operators received protection from competition and assistance in recovering debts from clients. In Avignon, under papal jurisdiction, the official red light district generated so much revenue that it became one of the city's primary funding sources for maintaining public infrastructure. Within these districts, further spatial segregation often occurred based on price and clientele. Premium establishments, serving wealthy merchants or nobility, might operate adjacent to humble single-room cabins serving laborers, creating economic stratification even within this modernized world. In Florence's official brothel area, higher-end courtesans occupied buildings closer to main thoroughfares, while lower-priced services were available in the maze of alleys behind. Number 2. Brothel licensing systems. How did medieval cities keep track of who could sell sex legally? Through elaborate licensing systems that would impress modern bureaucrats. Rather than criminalizing prostitution entirely, most medieval cities created official permits and registries that brought the trade under municipal control. These systems transformed prostitution from a moral issue into an administrative one, complete with paperwork fees and official oversight. In 14th century, London brothel keepers in Southwark paid annual licensing fees directly to the Bishop of Winchester, whose jurisdiction included this notorious district. Each establishment received an official seal that had to be displayed prominently, and quarterly inspections ensured compliance with regulations regarding everything from fire safety to the treatment of workers. Similar systems operated across Europe, with Florence's famous Office of Decency, Onesta, maintaining detailed records of every licensed prostitute, including their age, place of origin, and identifying physical marks. The licensing process itself could be remarkably intrusive. In Paris, women applying for prostitution licenses underwent interviews where officials determined if they had been corrupted enough to qualify. The bizarre logic being that only women already fallen should be permitted to work legally. Some German cities required applicants to demonstrate they had unsuccessfully attempted to find other employment before receiving authorization to work as prostitutes, creating a system that simultaneously stigmatized the profession while acknowledging many cities restricted brothel ownership to women, particularly widows who needed income. In 15th century, Dijon records show that 23 of 25 licensed brothel keepers were widows over 40 years of age. These women operated under strict rules. They could employ no more than a specified number of prostitutes, couldn't serve certain categories of men, particularly clergy or married men, and had to report any violence or disease immediately. License fees created substantial revenue. In Venice, brothel license cost more than those for bakeries or taverns, reflecting both moral taxation and economic reality. Sex sold better than bread or wine. Meanwhile, in Seville, brothel licenses were actually auctioned to the highest bidder, creating a competitive system where operators invested substantial capital before ever opening their doors. Perhaps most surprising was how these licenses sometimes conferred limited legal protections. licensed prostitutes in many cities could legally recover unpaid fees from clients, a right denied to unlicensed women. In Bologna, court records show numerous cases where registered prostitutes successfully sued clients for payment, with city officials enforcing these judgments. Similarly, in parts of Spain, licensed brothels could call upon city guards for protection, creating an early version of security services funded through licensing fees. The dark side of these licensing systems was how they trapped women in the profession. Once registered as a prostitute in many cities, women found it nearly impossible to have their names removed from official lists, even if they married or found alternative work. In Montpellier, women had to petition the city council and undergo a religious ceremony to be officially reformed, a process so expensive and humiliating that records suggest few ever completed it successfully. Number 1. Age and marital status restrictions. Who could legally become a prostitute in medieval times? Not just anyone. Despite prostitution's marginal status, medieval cities implemented surprisingly specific eligibility requirements. Most cities established minimum age requirements, typically between 16 and 20 years, though enforcement varied widely and documentation was often unreliable. Montpellier's regulations specifically prohibited girls whose breasts were not yet fully formed from registering, creating a physical rather than numerical age threshold. Marital status created another critical boundary. Nearly everywhere in medieval Europe, married women were strictly prohibited from working as prostitutes. This wasn't about protecting women, but about preserving male property rights. A husband had exclusive sexual access to his wife under medieval law. The penalties for married women caught prostituting themselves were typically more severe than those for single women violating other prostitution regulation. In Nuremberg, a married woman caught selling sex could face execution, while an unmarried woman might escape with flogging. Some cities went further, restricting prostitution based on family status. In parts of Italy, a woman couldn't register as a prostitute if she had living parents who objected, a rule that created a bizarre system where parents sometimes formally consented to their daughter's profession in exchange for financial support. Meanwhile, in Avignon, women with children were prohibited from working in higher-end establishments, but could work in lower-status brothels if their children lived elsewhere, creating a class system even within marginalized work. Religious background sometimes determined eligibility too. Christian women could legally work as prostitutes throughout most of Europe, but Jewish or Muslim women faced various restrictions depending on location. In Spanish territories, Muslim women captured during military campaigns could be forced into municipal brothels, while Christian women had to voluntarily register. Meanwhile, in some German cities, Jewish women were prohibited from prostitution entirely, not out of protection but to prevent what authorities considered contamination of Christian clients. Even physical appearance played a role in regulatory systems. Several Italian city-states, including Venice, maintained strange requirements that legally registered prostitutes be sufficiently attractive to justify their profession. Local officials actually evaluated women's appearance before granting licenses, creating a subjective standard that invited corruption and favoritism. Similarly, visible physical disabilities or skin conditions could disqualify women from legal registration, pushing those with differences into unregulated and more dangerous working arrangements. What appears consistently across these varied regulations is how they served social hierarchy rather than protecting vulnerable individuals. The eligibility restrictions overwhelmingly maintained existing power structures while creating bureaucratic mechanisms to monitor and control women's sexuality. For medieval authorities, determining who could legally sell sex wasn't primarily about morality, but about maintaining social boundaries and extracted revenue from marginalized people with limited options. Did medieval laws actually protect anyone involved in prostitution? Or were they mainly designed to protect everyone else from prostitutes? When you look at the harsh realities behind these 9 regulatory systems, what does that tell us about how societies view sex work even today?